Welcome back to the Modjeska Simkins School for Human Rights. This evening, of course, we have a very special guest who will be offering a fantastic presentation about history in South Carolina from the Reconstruction period through the early 20th century. And of course, our guest is Dr. Vernon Burton from Clemson University. My name is Robert Green. I'll be the moderator for this evening. And I think I can speak for everyone this evening when I say we are really looking forward to what will be a fantastic presentation. Now, as is the case with our other Modjeska School events, of course, please keep yourselves muted during the duration of the presentation. When Dr. Burton is done with his presentation, of course, we will open the floor for a question and answer session. And of course, the Q&A portions of our Modjeska events are always very lively, very informative, and very entertaining. So before we get to that, I wanted to see, Brett, do you have any words for the audience this evening before I introduce Dr. Burton?
Other than the fact that I'm just so pleased he's here, and one of the reasons I want to tell people why I'm so pleased he's here is that I missed meeting him when he knocked on Modjeska's door in 1974. I think I was in Columbia. I had gotten out of prison by then. And that he was a graduate student and doing a PhD dissertation at Princeton on Reconstruction, if I'm not wrong. And Modjeska took him in, asked him, well, you got a place to stay? And he didn't. And he ended up staying at Modjeska's house, kind of like Thurgood Marshall did when Thurgood Marshall knocked on her door in 1946. And so Vernon has been running in some pretty high cotton for a long time and is recognized as one of the experts on the period that we're talking about, which would be the reconstruction and the deconstruction of Reconstruction that still continues today. And Vernon is another one that we're gifted by Vernon being another one of those wonderful academics that has the vision of an activist. So welcome, Dr. Burton. We do appreciate your time.
Thank you.
And if we have technical issues, can it? You just talk. Don't worry about it.
All right, so I will go ahead and introduce Dr. Burton. And I know that oftentimes we have this saying in academia and elsewhere that this person needs no introduction. And that is the case with Dr. Burton, but I think he deserves an introduction nonetheless because his career has truly been one for the ages. Now, Dr. Burton, of course, is at Clemson University. He is the inaugural Judge Matthew J. Perry Distinguished Chair of History and Professor of Pan-African Studies, Sociology and Anthropology, and Computer Science at Clemson and a director of the Clemson Cyber Institute. Of course, Dr. Burton has written numerous books and articles. He's been the author or co-author of 20 books and edited books, along with over 200 articles, and also the author or director of very, very many digital humanities projects. So Dr. Burton is certainly a Renaissance man when it comes to how to disseminate information both inside and outside the academy. Of course, some of his best known books are, of course, include The Age of Lincoln, In My Father's House, or Many Mansions, Family and Community in Edgefield, South Carolina. Also, his most recent book is Penn Center, A History Preserved. And Dr. Burton has written many other books and articles as well. But tonight, of course, Dr. Burton is here with us to talk a bit about South Carolina history in the immediate aftermath of the Reconstruction era, a pivotal moment in the state's and the nation's history. And now what I'm going to do is turn the floor over to Dr. Burton. And again, I want to say on behalf of everyone here, we are in for quite a treat. So Dr. Burton, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We are very glad to have you tonight.
It's my pleasure, but I want to thank you for lowering expectations. And I'm afraid, unfortunately, that I'm not as prepared as I should be, but I'm going to change a little bit. I'm open to any question. So, feel free at any time to interrupt me if we're going in the wrong direction. But as I was thinking about this and thinking about the Simkins School, and I'm a great friend. I consider myself a friend, nowhere as close as Brent was, but I'm a great admirer of Modjeska Simkins. And I could spend the whole time just talking about Modjeska, but it is a school, and it made me think very seriously about education and democracy when I was thinking about what to do and related to South Carolina. And secondly, Brett and I actually met at Penn Center at one of the progressive meetings that he put together. a workshop. And so I've gone a different direction. If folks don't like it, stop me. And if they can't, please, if people are sending in things by chat, if they can't ask me, it never bothers me to be interrupted. And that goes to Brett for you. If you think I'm going the wrong direction, just say stop and go in another one. We may not get to where we want to go. And I'll send you at least 2 articles I think you have, but one on the history of the historiography of Reconstruction. Does everybody know what historiography is? I don't really know who the audience is. Historiography is sort of the history of history, or as I like to tell students, most people get their jollies in life from, say, religion, alcohol, drugs, and for historians, it's arguing about interpretations of history. Instead of sex or other things, it makes historians get very happy. So I have an essay about how we got to the interpretations that have dominated incorrectly for a long time Reconstruction, and Brett can send that out to you if he hasn't already. And I can't remember, we've been so busy between us trying to get things together or not. At any rate, I'll send it again if you don't have it, Brett, to do it. Any rate, I was thinking about the crisis we're in education and democracy. In the midst of a terrible civil war, Lincoln signed acts instituting the Morrill Act and the National Academy of Sciences. We desperately need the kind of leadership, in fact, I think, of a Morrill Act that Lincoln had done at this time. The historian Alan Nevins wrote in 1962 that the centennial of that act, it was an immortal moment in the history of higher education in America and the world when on July 2nd, 1862, Abraham Lincoln lifted his pen and signed the College Land Grant Act. In the 19th century, land grant colleges were called people's colleges. They were called former colleges. And they were also known as democracy's college. And that's a title I love. And that describes what I think education is really all about, whether college level, middle school, and particularly what you're doing in the Simkins schools. And that is, you are about democracy's colleges. And this is how it's supposed to work. In the mid 1800s, when reformers began a push for broader education, of higher education, they saw the need to offer practical knowledge and more science in the developing democratic republic. Darwin's Origins of the Species appeared in 1859. That's the very same year that President James Buchanan vetoed a bill calling for land grant colleges. The Morrill Act, I believe, was an American way of saying, as Darwin's book signified, that the Western world was ready to move into a new era of inquiry. Now, I'm going to spoil the ending of this story for everyone. This is an apocryphal story that I made up and I told at the University of Illinois. One of the things that I realized early on when I went there, and I taught a class, Survey of American History, both has 750 students. It's hard to believe. I've had more teaching assistants, graduate students who met with the students. I would do 2 lectures and they would meet with them first 2 and then 1 class. I had more teaching assistants. I've had students at Coastal Carolina and at Clemson, in fact, at the time. But one of the things that really got to me was realizing how uncritical students are. And I wanted to address that fact. They seem to believe everything. And I noticed one of the things that I was doing is basically I went to Furman and I was just reading the notes that I had taken at Furman again, or at Princeton, back to the students, and they were writing them down with not really much of a brain on my side of theirs going to it. So I told this story about coincidences in American history. My wife hates this story, and since she's upstairs doing her own Bible study thing, I'm going to go ahead and tell it. She never lets me tell it. It's one of my favorite. I talk about coincidences in history with students, such as Lincoln and Darwin being born on the same day, February the 12th, 1809. Adams and Jefferson dying on the same day of all days, July the 4th, 1826. Mark Twain, born when Halley's Comet came in 1835 and died when it appeared in 1910. Now, this is very disrespectful because both these men are dead now, but I told it when they were alive. And I must say, I sang in the Billy Graham choir when I was at Furman when he came for one of his big meetings. So I hope you'll forgive me for that. But I would say to students, and I guess you read just last week that Billy Graham and Oral Roberts died. Now, some of you may be so young you don't remember who they were. But Billy Graham is Franklin Graham's father. And Oral Roberts, of course, started Oral Roberts University. Both were major evangelicals. And I tell the story that the two of them are singing at the top of their voices, let the roll be called up yonder, and they're going into heaven, the pearly gate. St. Peter says, no, wait a minute. We've got to check and make sure that you're on the rolls, being good fundamentalists. They agreed, they looked, they hadn't made it. Now, they thought it was a mistake, but they said, well, we agreed to the rules, so we're going to do it. And so then they go to hell. And just 3 days later, Satan calls. And he says, I need to speak to God. And St. Peter says, well, she's busy out playing golf right now. He says, well, this is the hotline. And this is important. And that's what it's established for. So get God on the line. At which point, Satan said, do you remember those two guys you sent down last week, Graham and Oral Roberts? God said, yes. He said, well, you need to take them back. And he says, we can't do that. We established the ground rules long ago. He says, well, I don't care. I want you to know that Billy Graham's got 85% of the people saved in hell, and Oral Roberts likes $1.86 in air conditioning to air condition the whole place. I hope everybody's still there because I can't hear laughing. I suppose it's not going on. But it's
well, unmute and laugh if you want to hear us. You're doing fine. Carry on.
It was amazing. I met students 20 years later. They didn't remember anything else I said, but they would remember this story. But there is a point to it about being critical and not just believing what you see on the newspaper, what your history professor tells you, or anyone else. Now, the leadership in Congress took for granted that Lincoln would support the Land Grant College Act. Lincoln was about opportunity, a basis of political platform his entire life. We have no idea where Lincoln stood on the issue of education. And this little book I did, believe it or not, a very small book on the essential Lincoln. I had to choose 30 of the most important documents and show change over time with Lincoln. We excluded military, the Civil War kind of things. And it's interesting because two of those, which is maybe the only one with quite that many in it, deal with education. And the very, very first selection is Lincoln's first public statement, March 9, 1832, to the people of Sangamon County after the ambitious 20-year-old had lived in New Salem for only 6 months. He announced that he was a candidate for the Illinois legislature. He proclaimed, education is the most important subject which we as a people can be engaged in. Lincoln believed education promoted morality, sobriety, enterprise, and industry. He said he would be gratified if he were able to contribute to the advancement of education. Now, the essential Lincoln also includes a much lengthier endorsement of education. On September 30th, 1859, it's at the Wisconsin State Agricultural Society, Milwaukee, when Lincoln answers, of course, our own South Carolina Senator James Henry Hammond, class-based pro-slavery mud cell theory. Incidentally, Lincoln also signed legislation creating the Department of Agriculture. Now, scholars have always read Milwaukee's speech as Lincoln's defense of free labor. But it's equally, I think, if not more so, Lincoln's call for universal education and underscores his belief for the need for education and democracy. In part, Lincoln stated, and this is a very long quote, but do bear with me because I think it's worth listening to what Lincoln is saying on a lot of levels. By the mud seal theory, it is assumed that labor and education are incompatible and any practical combination of them impossible. everybody know what a mud seal is? They were actually pretty common. I grew up as a boy around 96. People would have them both at their house. It was called where you'd scrape off your boot and get all muddy, but there were also still some rail fences around, and the bottom rail stuck down in the mud, of course, was the mud rail as well. Now, according to that theory, a blind horse, incidentally, that's typical of Lincoln, it's a biblical reference from Psalm, upon a thread mill is a perfect illustration of what a laborer should be. All the better for being blind, that he could not tread out of place or kick understandingly. According to that theory, the education of laborers is not only useless, but pernicious and dangerous. In fact, it is in some sort deemed a misfortune that laborers should have heads at all. But free labor says no. Free labor argues that as the author of man makes every individual with one head and one pair of hands, it was probably intended that heads and hands should cooperate as friends, and that particular head should direct and control that particular pair of hands. In one word, free labor insists on universal education. Now, because Lincoln revered the Declaration of Independence, and he spoke of Jefferson, and because both Jefferson and Lincoln spoke and wrote on liberty, and are both seen as champion of the common man, we often, I think way too often, see Lincoln as a 19th century Jeffersonian. But Lincoln was no strict constructionist. Lincoln's link to the founding fathers was to Alexander Hamilton and John Marshall. His Whig politics were the government of intervention of Daniel Webster, and his beau ideal Henry Clay in the American system. Lincoln understood that democracy was not static, that it progresses and also retreats, and that education is critical to democracy. History, the news, your newspapers are all interpretation. I've always tried to teach that in my classes. Now, part of our mission, it seems to me, in education, and exactly what I think you're doing there, is also teaching. And part of that is to get the story straight. And it's probably never been more messed up in our history than in the American South. And South Carolina is a prime example in race relations. So I really admire what you folks are doing there at the Simkins Center. And I think it's critical, as I said, for democracy. Now, for 34 years, I was a historian at the University of Illinois. I wrote the book, The Age of Lincoln, and returned home to South Carolina. Although I argue in the book that Lincoln was the greatest president, the greatest theologian of the 19th century, and most significantly, that Lincoln was a white Southerner, I've discovered on my return that Lincoln is no longer liked in South Carolina. Now, Lincoln was not this demonized when I was a boy growing up in that rural and cotton mill, or near it actually, the cotton mill town of 96. And like fake news and alternative facts, the culture wars have been bad for both our history, our historical memory, our country, and especially for democracy. And I hope you're seeing a map here. It's an actual map. So in spite of my childhood memories of a certain fondness and identity among Black and white Southerners for Lincoln, this slide provides evidence of South Carolina's longstanding dislike of Lincoln. The map illustrates actually the locations of where donations come from to buy Lincoln's birthplace and boyhood home. The contribution to buy the land for this Kentucky part were given between 1906 and 1911 for the centennial of Lincoln's birth. And the National Park Service had records of over 140,000 donations. People across the United States contributed. Now, I hope you can see this one little area. I'm trying to, I guess, I don't know if you can see my mark or not, but if you look there, there's only one place where, in fact, there weren't donations. And of course, that's our own South Carolina. This is, however, something that historians are trained to examine. Notice that we do not have all the data. I was suspicious when I first saw this map. I was writing the book at that time about, and oh my goodness, I have lost, some reason, I have lost how to move forward with the PowerPoint. Let's see. So we may be stuck here, folks. Well, maybe we won't do.
Actually, I am pulling up the PowerPoint on my end. Can anyone see my screen?
I've got it now. Here we
You've
go.
got it.
Yeah, well, yeah, it should be. Yeah, there you go. Some reason when I did it, it did it. And you could see the map, right? When I had it there?
Yes. Mhm.
Okay.
But
Okay.
it says you are on my screen. It says you're viewing Robert Green's screen.
Okay,
That
so
we are viewing. Yeah, Robert.
Yeah, I have the
Green.
map up now.
Yeah.
Okay. So are we, or am I doing it or are you doing it, Robert? Can you tell?
It looks like I'm doing it right now. Because the map wasn't up earlier when you first mentioned it, so I'll put up the map from my end just to make sure everybody can see it.
You know, did we even go back to me sharing?
You know what? I don't think so.
I don't even.
But it's all right. I've got it from here, so don't worry about it.
All right, you can just move along with this
Yeah.
then. Okay, I'm just going to talk about it. I'm very sorry, folks. That's one of the problems of doing these kind of things not in person. Well, as I said, at this time, I was doing a book on Penn Center, so I knew very well that people there, particularly Robert Smalls, was still alive. And Robert Smalls was a great admirer and hero. He was a great Civil War hero, Reconstruction leader, and he adored Lincoln. He broke down in tears when he heard about Lincoln being killed. And I actually used both he and Lincoln as sort of ideas of how masculinity had changed. I don't know any two tougher men in the world, and yet both of them were like Smalls was emotional, cried about Lincoln's death. Lincoln could be fighting somebody, beat them up in a wrestling match, and next minute reading poetry and burst into tears. So different ideas. Everybody, I assume, knows who Robert Smalls is. In South Carolina, it's just an amazing story, a genuine Union Civil War hero, held up as an example of why African Americans should be allowed to enlist and fight as Union soldiers. He actually met with Lincoln, and Lincoln, I mean, they literally had him tour um, uh, to show that African American could fight in the Civil War, things like that. And he met with Lincoln, and Lincoln asked him, why would he risk his life, his family's life, his men's life, to steal the planter and sail it out under the nose of the Confederacies? And he gave him a one-word answer, which was freedom. And that's exactly what Lincoln echoed in his Gettysburg Address less than a year later. Of course, Smalls was elected to Congress during Reconstruction. One African American I found in the newspaper, a cute story, who proclaimed that Smalls was the greatest man ever lived. His companion challenged me. He said, well, what about Jesus Christ? He said, well, Robert Smalls is young yet. Well, given the history books available in Jim Crow, South Carolina, one can understand, though, how the great jazz musician Dizzy Gillespie, who attended Robert Smalls School in segregated Cheraw, was dismayed that he did not know who Robert Smalls was until decades after he left the South. This is a quote from Gillespie. The school that I attended, which was named after this great Black man, never taught us 3 words about him. I was over 40 years old before I found out. Good trivia question: is a South Carolinian who ran for president besides Jesse Jackson is Dizzy Gillespie. Now there are a number of books written about Small, but still many people do not know who he is. After a South Carolina educational television program on Smalls aired during Black History Month in 2016 on Facebook, a memes on Small went viral. One person posted, "Never heard of him. If this is a true story, then the American educational system has failed me again." Another wrote, "Stories like this never made it into our biased public school curriculum. Until now, I've never heard of this man or his amazing story." Clearly, we need museums and monuments to tell about Robert Smalls, his part in South Carolina American history. Now, as I said, in 2016, and just before his second term ended, are you advancing this for me? I'm sitting here advancing, not knowing. I guess it doesn't matter, does it, Robert?
No, please go right ahead. I am on the Robert Small slide right now. So.
Let's okay. We'll go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. I'm just going to show these pictures of Penn Center. That's where I met Brett and found out about the progressive group in South Carolina.
Okay.
President Barack Obama, so if you can see, you can move it forward. I'm sorry, I can't do this for you. Um, Signed legislation designating Penn Center and parts of Beaufort as National Historic Sites. These sites were the first national monuments to Reconstruction to be officially enshrined in our country's national park system. On March 18, 2017, the National Park Service launched the Reconstruction Park at Penn Center with a dedication ceremony of the Reconstruction Era National Monument. Should have a picture of Michael Allen there with that, who worked hard to make that happen. President Obama made first national park system. Not good. Hold on. Let's see. I don't know. Let me see if I can turn off my phone. Uh, well, Obama made the national parks on Reconstruction, and let's go through too, because I think this is wonderful about this area, because it links these two periods. The first Reconstruction, which we think of as traditional Reconstruction. People look at, I've argued in Age of Lincoln, of course, that it doesn't end, and certainly not until the 1890s, and with Ben Tillman's Constitution there. In 1895, the Constitutional Convention that disfranchises and also brings in legal segregation. But the point is, can you go through and show those pictures?
Sure.
I don't know if I'm seeing, I don't think I see yours. I'd like to see so we could tell. I could tell a little bit. Anyway, I love some of them. You'll see the ones of Martin Luther King Jr. there. He was in the citizenship school. John Baez, James Lawson there, all right here at Penn Center, an amazing place.
Hold it right there. Vernon, if you can't see this, let me tell people what they're looking at. That happens to be Joan Baez, and there you see Dr. King looking at her, and there's Robert Abernathy sitting right next to him. And that is in the very same room that Orville Burton, I call him Vernon, met me at Penn Center, because we were founded in that very room in 1996, and I was in that room in the 60s working for the Southern Student Organizing Committee, meeting John Lewis. So that's a very historic room that Vernon has on the screen there, and we'll be back there someday.
Yeah, and when I was working with Penn Center, I tried to convince them they should rent out the King bedroom, like they do the Lincoln bedroom, to raise money. I was worried they were going to survive. They'll be okay now, but he was such a Spartan in those things, it wouldn't do it. There's some great stories from Andrew Young and Vernon Jordan about just how sparse King was. They often thought they didn't get enough to eat and things. So there's some wonderful stories that go along with. And you can just see, this is one of my favorite, because King is enjoying Joan Baez and just relaxing. And they actually built at Penn Center a place for him. He never got to use it because he was assassinated before it got there. But what I like about this, it links those two reconstructions as they should be linked, and right here at South Carolina. One of the things, Ms. Seisloff, Courtney Seisloff, was director when a lot of this was happening. And somebody asked her, well, did the civil rights movement happen at Penn Center? And she basically said, well, the whole civil rights movement came through Penn Center. And they did. Almost everybody came through there, and the citizenship schools were really run from there as well. So I thought you might enjoy seeing the link there. At any rate, I knew that there were a lot more donations. We can go back to the second map. So I went back, and indeed there were more donations, and you can see these are, there you go. Here's a map of where there were. And so the point of all this long way, in fact, it's sort of fun for me because you can see where the donations came from in South Carolina. And there's some of those old unionists in this area who had been Republicans and unionist support, and Republicans anti the slave power there. And of course, the low country where so much of the African-American population were doing. So as more facts became available, the picture can change. The facts were not fake, were not alternative, they were incomplete. These maps also, I think, underscore the importance of access to the historical record and the importance of archives and libraries and the preservation of records such as Modjeska Simkins. And Brett knows this story that she had a bunch of her records and she'd offered me to take some of them to look at, but I was interested in Reconstruction at the time on her back porch, and somebody stole the file cabinet they were in. Which I'm sure they didn't care about the papers, but right off her back porch, a lot of her papers and things. Though there are some at South Carolina, and I think you're doing to get more together as well, Brett, as I remember. The danger of interpretations do not have all the information, I think, is important to understand. We also need to remember that most Southern state archives were segregated. Black scholars were not allowed to research there until the mid-1960s, and some even later. And many university libraries and state archives were not interested in collecting papers or documenting the records that recorded African-American perspective until the 1970s or later. Penn Center offered its papers to the University of South Carolina in 1963. And the archives would take them, but somebody higher up refused them. And the reason was that there was part of the stipulation, anybody who wanted to look at these papers was welcome to look at them. And of course, the reason was to keep Black scholars from looking at these papers. I have a picture of John Hope Franklin with two of my daughters and one of my daughter's 5 foster kids at the time beside her. That's in my living room at University of Illinois on the 50th anniversary of Brown v. Board. Now, John Hope was actually asked to go to Washington, D.C. about 2 weeks before that to celebrate that. And he turned him down to come to University of Illinois because we had planned this for a long time, he said, and it wasn't just a thrown together thing when they thought of it later at the White House. That's always impressed me. But if you want to understand the importance of this, John Hope Franklin, of course, was a graduate student at Harvard. His dissertation was on the free African-American community during the time of enslavement in North Carolina. A lot of people don't realize that freed African-Americans in North Carolina could vote until after the Nat Turner insurrection, and they changed the Constitution, and they actually swayed some elections in local situations. So John's dissertation and book was very important to make people aware of this, that voting was still there for African Americans, certainly at the time of the Constitution until after 1830. But he went to do his research, and the University of North Carolina Library said they had no place for him because the law was segregation. And since he couldn't work there, they said they had to prepare a place. And John talked with a person, said, I really need to do this research. And the archivist was also hard. So he said, okay, I'm gonna put a chair in the archives where the records are for you, and you can work there. And that was working fine until white scholars discovered that John Hope was there. And that's not fair. He gets access to the records and gets to go look at the records he wants to, and we can't, at which point they integrated University of North Carolina's waiting room or where researchers work. And that is actually why Penn Center papers went there. John Hope, way back when he's doing his research, did. At any rate, I think it's interesting to look at that thing, this sort of perspective. So we need that variety of sources, and we actually need a variety of general interpretation of historical events. It expands our thinking, our own thinking. Southerners, far more concerned with their history than Yankees are. South Carolina established the state archives in 1905 when the South Carolina legislature established the South Carolina Historical Commission. The state constructed the fireproof building in Charleston between 1822 and 1827 as the first fireproof structure in the nation specifically to protect documents. The South Carolina Historical Society began renting 2 floors in 1943 and the South Carolina Library dates to the very founding and building of the University of South Carolina. By contrast, in New York State, a state archives limited solely to government documents was not created until 1971. The obsession with the lost cause had something to do with this desire to create a repository of South Carolina's history, as did the relative, I think, heterogeneity of the white population in the South, which completely ignored that Black portion and thus could celebrate what white Southerners saw as a common history much easier than the ethnically and religiously diverse white population of the North. In any event, in New York, with its own legacy of slavery, with a Black population about 2% of the total in 1900, though North York City already had the largest Black population of any city in the country, they could be ignored with what has been called the epistemology of ignorance, but not so in South Carolina. So our libraries and archives are essential, and one must understand the context of these historical records and how different interpretations develop. It also explains if there weren't the sources there, and if Black scholars couldn't get into the archives, why our history partly, not always, was written as it was, particularly about Reconstruction and slavery. South Carolina left the Union and attempted to succeed. We can guess why, but if we really want to know why, we can read the documents they wrote explaining why. They made it clear it was to preserve slavery and to have the right to extend slavery into other areas. After the Civil War, the same people said other things like states' rights. So which do you think is more accurate? What they said were the reasons when they declared secession, or what they said after a bloody and costly war that they lost? Much of history is an interpretation of the actual facts. There is an essential difference in alternative facts and alternative interpretations based on certain facts. The documents in 1960 recorded the fact that people voting for secession said they were leaving the Union to protect slavery. Now, Charlestonian Stephen Colbert, when he did the Colbert Report, rather than his now late show with Stephen Colbert, said that rewriting history is a good thing because we can make it better. He recommended, since an African American had been elected president in 2008, we can say that slavery never existed. Now, although done in humor, there are indications that in a court of white popular opinion, as well as some justices on the Supreme Court, and among some historians even, this is some degree happening. That is an interesting interpretation of facts and revisionist history. Here's a little story of one man's way of changing his interpretation of events. The story occurred during Reconstruction, the most progressive and misunderstood period in all of American history. As the story goes, a Union company comprised of previously enslaved African Americans was stationed in a small southern town immediately after the war. Each morning, the squad of dignified militia commanded by a young white lieutenant marched in the town square, raised the American flag. Directly across from the flagpole was the home of Beauregard Gary Butler III, who had lost 2 sons in the war. From the piazza of his many-column mansion, the hoar-headed old man listened as a bugler blew, watched as the flag rose, and then yelled at the top of his lungs, "You damn Yankees might have won the war, but us rebels sure beat the hell out of you at Chickamauga." This unnerved the Union officer, who warned Butler not to disrupt the ceremony or he would be imprisoned for treason. Nevertheless, Butler's routine continued unabated, and the officer marched the old man off to jail. All was fine until late Saturday night, when the unreconstructed rebel began thinking about Sunday morning and how, since the building of that building in 1836, Butler had always sat on the third pew. When he could stand it no longer, he called for the lieutenant. The Union officer informed Butler that the condition of his release included taking the oath of allegiance, that meant renouncing the Confederacy, and take the oath to the United States, and Butler's word of honor that he would no longer embarrass the morning ritual by shouting, "You damn Yankees might have won the war, but us rebels sure beat the hell out of you at Chickamauga." Butler agreed. On Monday morning, as usual, the old man sat grinning on the porch. As the bugler began and the flag unfurled, Butler let out with a yell, "Us damn Yankees might have won the war, but them rebels sure beat the hell out of us at Chickamauga." Now, usually the definition of who is us and who is them changes the story. My point is the significance of American history is seen differently by differing groups. That does not mean that all interpretations are equal. Facts need to be real. Alternative facts, that is, those without evidence, are not historical. In what historians now call postmodern history, we can all agree that interpretations are constructed, but it matters that the narrative or interpretation is constructed of. And I used to read The Three Little Pigs to my kids, and I would say, you know, it does matter what you build your story out of. These are complicated issues and may require compromises. We need to own and analyze our complicated legacies to understand the historical context of the times and understand the complexities of human nature. And where does the general public learn their history? Not from the books the scholars write. If they did, my grandkids would have a lot larger college fund, but from what they see memorialized, like these buildings and statues we've been discussing. People learn from historical monuments, markers, museums, public history, the name of buildings. So when I grew up in 96, we had two markers, one about the Cherokees and the other celebrated, in fact, Preston Brooks, Canon of Charles Sumner, there you go, in the US Senate. Now, it is no wonder we were state champions in football. Every boy knew the way to get a historical marker was to beat the fire out of someone. Teaching interpretation is important, but people learn history not from books, but from what we tell them important. That's another reason I think it's so important that you have preserved Modjeska Simkins' home. And why I'm going to take just a little time, and I can stop, Brett, whenever you want me to. We can get on to the actual historical thing, but I want to go through a little bit of the State House grounds and why it is so very important. Now, Dr. Ben Mays was from my hometown, and I didn't even know that he was from my hometown. It was not to Religious Emphasis Week at Furman University that I met Dr. Mays. I think it was my junior, it could have been my senior year. I believe we already had SOC there, so it at least was my junior year. And it was not that the town mothers and fathers were ignoring him, they just did not know who he was. I think that's one of the horrors of segregation. His recognition now in Greenwood, I think, is important because now at the Mays Historical Site in Greenwood, there's a 7-foot statue. And this apostle of peace and advocate, a man of grace, is an alternative role model for all youth, Black and white, in Greenwood. It's the only statue of a person in Greenwood. And I think we send an important message in South Carolina. And those are the ones, those monuments we have on the State House grounds. There are 5 statues to South Carolinians on the State House grounds, and every single monument on our State House ground is to a white male who supported slavery, Civil War, segregation, or white supremacy. Now, there's a controversy over toppling statues, a tradition that goes back to the Revolution and removal of statues of George III. People like the term cancel culture. I don't agree with using that time. We don't have time to discuss it here unless you folks want to. But I could add that with technology, barcodes, mobile smartphones, augmented reality, we could do something about this, at least to get a more accurate portrayal of who these people are and the complex they are. I used to say that not one African American was singled out by name on the State House grounds. That's changed, however. If you go to the Strom Thurmond monument, that's James Burns. Okay, there's the stuff. Go to the next one. Thurmond family, I think, should be commended by adding SMA Washington to the names of Senator Thurmond's children, but that's not the same thing. In 2001, a monument to now 1/3 of the citizens of South Carolina was installed as part of a compromise to move the battle flag of Northern Virginia and Tennessee from the dome of the State House to the Confederate monument. Although this beautiful sculpture was paid for by private donations, the commission for the project insisted that no individual could be depicted in case controversial African Americans like Denmark Vesey might be included. It's interesting because you can see that probably there's somebody with a robe on, that's probably Judge Finney. You can see there's somebody with an astronaut, so Ronald McNair, but it's not supposed to be. Once again, we have our double standard for Black and white South Carolinians. As controversial whites are definitely allowed to be memorialized on the State House grounds with and not African Americans, any African Americans, right, as an individual. So,
Vernon, let me
yeah,
interrupt you because there's
sure.
something really critical about this monument here that I was involved with the back and forth when it was being put up.
Okay,
And the arguments were that they didn't want any identifiable black person on there. And the
right,
main fight was over Denmark Vesey.
right.
And as it moves through the generations, I think you get somebody that kind of resembles Jim Clyburn. But that not only are there no people of color lifted up, there was an actual effort, successful effort to suppress their presence.
Yeah, no, I agree. I thought I'd said that. Maybe I didn't, Brett, but I think there's a lot to be said about this. I mean, it's a beautiful piece, but it's also, I could go into say it, we don't have one to white. It's again sort of saying all black people are sort of there. We're recognizing it. And this is a state, of course, who until 1930, almost always, there's a little exception, had a majority African American population and the contributions that are gone there. Now, sometimes, in fact, this is from a Francis Butler Simkins, who is related to, in fact, Modjeska Simkins' husband. He told her, he met her and told him. And he was an interesting historian. I still recommend his book on Reconstruction. It was even out before Du Bois's book was. He could get into the archives. It's an important book, and it's pretty amazing. But he also, sort of like Faulkner, but worse than Faulkner, went back the other way. George Brown Tyndall, the historian, he inspired so many of them with what was considered an enlightened view, and he's showing that Reconstruction progressed to the competence of African American, particularly leaders and others at the time. Uh, so when George Brown Tyndall met him at a Southern meeting, he said he had heard that he opposed ending segregation, integration. And Simpkins said to him, hell, you know, I support slavery. So his political life and his historical life are two different things. It's interesting to sort of deal with that, I think, and how we do it. Now, my generation was part of a generation that sort of thought that we had to get rid of heroes. The great white men, I like to say, particularly for Confederacy, who turned the South prematurely gray. But one of the things I have learned and sort of changed my mind about is I still think the idea of making heroes is difficult, but people are going to find role models, and they find them in these monuments, in these statues, and in these names and buildings. So I think we've got to find a way to deal with that. And part of that is to get people like Modjeska Simpkins recognized, like Reverend Joe Delane and Briggs and Robert Smalls and so many others. And like, I'm so pleased with what has been done with Dr. Mays. I can be critical as well of how it's done, but that in fact there are alternative role models, and they're also for whites. I had the picture of Laura Towns that was there, or Henry Brisbane. There's so many. There was always. This is what gives a lie that at the time history was different, people felt different, and there was always someone in South Carolina standing on the right side of history and arguing for justice and equality, white and black, throughout our history at that time. I like this quote by Francis Butler Simpkins. Sometimes Southern historians forget what is often important to Southerners is not what actually happened, but what is believed to have happened. So I think that is an important thing to remember. Well, at least me talking, because I know you want to talk about specific history. So in conclusion, my wife said to always say that. It gives the audience some hope. I think it's an exciting time actually to be a historian in South Carolina. I came back here deliberately. I began as a redheaded stepchild at Clemson, and then I became Mr. Chips, and sort of everybody liked me. My wife said I just can't stand to be liked. That's why I left. But I really came back because I wanted to make a difference. And it's been pretty discouraging. So it's good to see that Brett and Robert Greene and others are doing good things. But politically, it can get very discouraging here, I do know. So I want to conclude on a positive note on this. Then we can talk about anything you want to, specific history. Martin Luther King Jr., you can go through those things too. I refuse to accept the idea that the isness of man's present nature makes him morally incapable of reaching up for the eternal altness that forever confronts him. It may look grim, but we must keep on keeping on and onward, or as Lincoln reminded us, determine that the thing can and will be done, and then we will find the way. I had a little bit there, you know, on the emancipation on King's I Have a Dream speech. And of course, that was initially to be the Emancipation Day 100th anniversary. So that's why he talks so much about Lincoln in the beginning there. And I'm sure you folks know the story of Mahalia Jackson, who would sing to him at night and things, and said to him, you know, it wasn't going that well. Tell him about your dream, Martin, which he talked to her about, and then he changes and goes off script with I Have a Dream speech. Why don't I stop there, and hopefully there's some questions. You can't hurt my feelings, I promise you. I have 5 daughters, and every time one reached 11, 12, or 13, depending on which daughter, I went from somebody, you know, who could walk on water to somebody who could not swim, though I was doing the same thing. So you will not injure my feelings being critical of this. I'm not sure where I was going with all this exactly, but the importance of telling our story, of telling the complete story. Brett can send out the 2 articles, I think, but in particular, when I went through 96 high school and graduated in 1965, we used the Sims Oliphant history, 4 mentions of slavery, and they were all about how basically kind it was. And in Reconstruction, one of the assignments, remember, Black children used these books, same textbooks. And one of the assignment was pretend your father rode with the red shirts and write an essay. Can you imagine what kind of effect? We got a lot to pay for there. You know, Mississippi, after South Carolina's Brown v. Board, Mississippi passed a law that you had to teach about our way of life, that is white supremacy, in the 8th and another 2 grades. I forgot which one. South Carolina didn't have to do that because with Tillman's, the year after Tillman's Constitution, 1896, they have in that you teach that in our in the laws was enacted that early. So they understood the importance of history and propaganda and interpretation. You want to take over, Robert, and ask some questions?
Yes, definitely. So thanks first off, Dr. Burton, for that wonderful presentation. I think everyone enjoyed that. I know I certainly learned a lot from it. And I wanted to ask a few questions before really opening the floor for questions from the audience writ large, so I won't speak too long. But one thing I was really curious about was you mentioned just a few minutes ago about the need to really push for more memorialization of Black South Carolinians. And I want to ask you first off, if you were put in charge of the South Carolina State House grounds, and you had a chance to just fundamentally alter the entire ground in terms of no concern about the Heritage Act or anything else, what would you do to the State House grounds to really highlight those people you just referred to? And who would you highlight in particular?
Well, I would start, since we had one. First, I really do think there's so many people. Denmark Vesey, as you know, there's a controversy about exactly what happened with the Denmark Vesey thing, but ignoring that, I think he's important. And even the Stono Rebellion, though people don't like to deal with those sort of things, but Robert Smalls would clearly be there. And here's a white person, Laura Towns, who spent her life dedicated there. It's Robert Smalls' friend who came down to Penn Center for education purposes. I said earlier, you know, there's 2 things that South Carolina is really sort of did that's central to American history. We know about the Civil War. You can't go into a courthouse to register to vote without almost having to go by a Confederate soldier memorializing white supremacy. What a message that sends to the Black soldier. But nowhere do you see, hardly at all, this group out of Somerton who began what becomes Brown v. Board, in which many people believe should have been named either Briggs v. Elliott or certainly for Joe Delane, who really led that as the minister. And it is the case that Thurgood Marshall ordered. And when you think about it, the Civil Rights Act sort of comes out of that too as well with Brown v. Board. It really starts in South Carolina. The rights of gay, lesbian, trans, and other people, older people, Native American, all of that comes right. And where do you see that commemorated? People are beginning to be aware of it, but nowhere. So there's a lot. I'm not so sure if we didn't have all these monuments, I'd feel so strongly about it. But I think we need to have these alternative role models there for people. Memorialization is a problem because we're all human, and I'll give you the best example I know. That's myself. As a graduate student, I grew up and I just thought Thomas Jefferson or wrote Declaration. I loved Thomas Jefferson, like most white, Democratic kids growing up my generation. I go to Princeton and I discover that not only was he a slave owner, which I hadn't really thought about that, and owned enslaved people, but that at that time they weren't quite sure, but that he was probably the father of enslaved people. And if you think about it, a young woman who's underage, what position you have. So I sort of threw the baby out with the bathwater. I still remember I read Bob Macaulay's book, and I really loved it. It was critical of Jefferson. And when I got to be his colleague, I discovered that he had written this book because he's a monarchist and he hates Jefferson because of the Democratic thing. And there's some balance. People can do good things on one side and another way be bad. You get the same thing with Tillman. Tillman, who is the epitome of the racist Southern demagogue, and yet it was the Tillman Act that was trying to keep money out of politics that Citizens United overturned. So how do you deal with complexity? I don't think memorials are a good way to deal with them, but as long as they're there, and I don't see them coming down even with the Heritage Act very easily without almost another civil war. I think the least we can do is contextualize those, but more important, to build others that give us these alternative role models of people who were on the right side of history, who did stand for justice, in particular, who fought for racial justice and equality. I would think all these civil rights lawyers like Boo Ware, some of these early ones, so important when you think about what they were up against. Isaac Woodard, Brett was telling me they're doing a PBS special on that, but there's so many. But I would certainly think these Reconstruction leaders, and Smalls is just one of many, need to be celebrated, or at least recognized. At least recognized. I mean, I've argued in the age of Lincoln that the true heirs of sort of a Lincoln and the millennial sort of tradition of reforming a progressive America are African Americans who believed in the same thing Lincoln did, and that is a meritocracy and equal rights under the law.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And to follow up on that question, before I turn it over to the group for a general Q&A, I did want to also ask you, you mentioned a moment ago when we were talking about Martin Luther King Jr. at Penn Center and the linkages between the first and second Reconstructions. Now, there have been some folks who have argued that we're going or living through what might be termed a third Reconstruction. What do you say in response to that? Do you think we're living through a third Reconstruction, or do you think that idea is doesn't quite work for our time period?
Well, I really like Reverend Barber, since she's got a nice blurb on my new book on justice deferred race in the Supreme Court. So I really like it. He wrote the, calling for the third Reconstruction. I had high hopes, but the 4 years before this one's really thrown us, it's almost like an overthrow. So I have hopes. I think it's a little early to see. I think the Black Lives Matter movement has made an extraordinary consciousness. Now, I bet there's not a Black person in South Carolina who didn't know that this is what police did. But until it was shown, whether it's 8 or 9 minutes now, they're arguing, of this policeman with his knee on George Floyd's back, people could deny it. It was the same thing with the civil rights movement. I always had my students write an essay. Why did the second civil rights movement, in other words, the second Reconstruction, why was it successful, at least as far as getting the, Civil Rights Act and the 65 Voting Rights Act passed? And we think that Reconstruction did not continue. I don't want to say it wasn't successful. I think it was extraordinarily successful, left a huge, important legacy. And I think the answer is pretty clear again. When people turned on television and saw dogs attacking people, when they saw, in fact, water hoses rolling people down the things, and just saw the kind of things of a Bull Connor slapping C.T. Vivian or things of that nature, they could no longer deny that these nice, polite white people they like weren't doing things like that. And it brought the reality there. Whereas in the first Reconstruction, you can just see, whites, this doesn't happen. I worry because I argue in the age of Lincoln that it is in fact not the majority of white people who overthrew Reconstruction with terror and terrorism. It was just most, quote, white people did nothing. And that's what worries me now is, Black people are trying to do something, but how are we going to get white people to step up and do the right thing? And I think there is a parallel there. So I don't know if we're in a third Reconstruction, and I don't, as you know, I hate the term redemption because they take a good religious term and words are so important. And then they make it sound like something wonderful when it's a terroristic overthrow, a coup d'etat here in South Carolina of a legitimately democratically elected, at that time, Republican racial legislature and government. And to call it redemption for someone like me who grew up a Baptist, it really hurts very much because you sort of like that term. Although I will say now, I made it all the way to a Presbyterian elder at University of Illinois from a Baptist deacon, American Baptist, first student. And I think if I had stayed those 2 more years out and maxed out my retirement, I think I'd have made Episcopalian because I was on my way up before I left. And everything's sort of gone the other way since I got back. Does that answer, Robert, for you or not?
Definitely. Yes, that's a great answer.
I'd like to. David Donald once, I really liked David Donald. He was once asked about what would Lincoln say about busing. And and his great response was, he said, well, the first thing Lincoln would say is, what is a bus? I honestly, I wish I were a prophet. I learned this. I won this award at the age of Lincoln, and they had us there. The guy that I had my book, they did a big thing in Chicago, and another guy had won the fiction award, the Heartland Fiction. I'd won and we were sitting about 5 people up there by us getting their books signed, bought them. And there was a person on the other end, and the line went all the way out. You couldn't even see how far it went down the street in Chicago. It was huge. And finally I got a break and I said, ma'am, who are you? And she was someone who had written the story. She was about this TV show about prophets and, mediums and things like that. So I wish I were a prophet. I'd do a lot better, I think, with books and things.
All right. So what I want to do now is actually get the Q&A from the audience started. I do see a couple of questions in the chat. So if you have a question, you can put it in the chat, or you can raise your hand via the reaction button on the bottom of your Zoom page. But the first question I see in the chat from Gene Hammock is, how would you teach history to today's children? And this is a very interesting question.
Well, I assume she means Scooter. You know, I did a
Yes.
workshop that Brett came to. You were at the workshop itself, weren't you, Brett? As I remember.
I was indeed. Lincoln's Unfinished Business. I
Yeah,
met Modjeska's niece
we
for
had
the
a
first time.
conference on that. That's right. We gave out your books and things. I think it's very important we have to deal with it. And I probably wasn't very clear, but I think one way to do it is interpretation and historiography. And I have taught it successfully with fourth graders. And, you know, when I was at University of Illinois, the most distinguished professor called me in my second year there and said he didn't even teach historiography to his graduate students. And this is the basic survey in history. You should not be teaching historiography because they need to know the facts, because they're engineers. It'll be the only history course they ever have. And I argued, well, you know, if it's the only course they're going to have, I don't want them just to believe everything they read, because I had read Sims Oliphant and what you hear, but to think that almost everything you get is interpreted or filtered through something. So I think that's one way to do it, and it is hard. How do you deal with lynching? Jim Lowen's book, when he brought the court case in Mississippi, there's now a book on his book. It's sort of interesting about conflict and change in Mississippi, and so the opposing side for the state, they would not let it be adopted by even give a choice for the school district to be adopted in Mississippi. So the state's attorney said, well, we cannot use this book. It's got a picture of a lynching in it. And so the judge looked at him and he said, well, this is a history book, isn't it? He says, well, yes, Your Honor. He says, did lynchings occur in Mississippi? And he said, well, yes, Your Honor. He says, well, shouldn't it be in a history book? I think one of the problems we have is whites cannot understand. We often get the perspective of Black South Carolinians because we do not know and are unaware of what they have faced. I do not mean this. I love school teachers, public school teachers. I married a school teacher. Public school teachers are doing God's work. I really believe that. So I don't mean this to be critical, but I have now taught South Carolina history at Coastal, at College of Charleston, and at Clemson. I have not yet had so far, if they're telling the truth, one Black or white student who knows about the Orangeburg Massacre. You know, we literally have created this image that South Carolina is not like those rednecks down in Georgia, Mississippi, and Alabama. We had integration with dignity, and the Harvey Gantt story sort of turned our image in South Carolina 180 degrees. Before that, if you look at the earlier work, it was South Carolina and Mississippi who were seen as the most violent. We don't remember the school buses with children on them with Black being attacked during the 1970 election. I'm not talking about, you know, that period of history when we overthrew Reconstruction. And literally, terrorism did not start with 9/11, not for African Americans. It was at least from, if you want to include slavery, from the end of slavery, at least until 1965 and the Voting Rights Act, African Americans lived in a terroristic society. There's no telling how many people were killed that we don't know about. When Martin Luther King Jr. went to jail, they were terrified, his family was, and for good reason. How many people have gone in jail, never been heard of from again? That's why the Isaac Woodard story is important for people to understand. This was South Carolina. This is integration with dignity. So, you know, when people, the other thing I've just done in this book with Armin Durfner on justice deferred, race in the Supreme Court, is to point out just the almost a quantitative statistical analysis of what it's meant that you had redlining, what it meant that with the GI Bill that African American, well, first they couldn't go to the University of South Carolina or Clemson with the GI Bill. They had to go to historically Black college. And I'm not trying to say anything wrong with that, but that was a difference. Even, you know, Ben Mays, who was president of Morehouse College, always said that segregation, you just could not be equal to make it, even with the best of these schools, but the way Social Security was set up, all of these things were set up to disadvantage African Americans. So how do you make up for that? It's not like when people talk about reparations for slavery. That's why this Northwestern thing, I wish they had not called it reparations, is addressing a specific court issue of redlining. But it has been a continual history. It's like I argue that Reconstruction, you cannot say it really ended in 1876 with the overthrow of this biracial group of, at that time, Republicans, and it continues on. But in fact, you can see the civil rights movement never ending throughout South. There's one generation, Ben Mays writes about the pictures of Reconstruction leaders on the walls that he rose up in his home with, of recognizing that there was a time that you hope will, with vote, will come back. That's the other thing, is to teach about the centrality of the vote and how important the vote is another thing about teaching, I think, for students early on, just how important that if you don't have a voice at the table, it's very hard to get people to understand. It's like I said in '96, it was not that people were anti-Ben Mays. They didn't know who he was, Horace segregation. And it's the same thing I found out in testifying throughout almost every county in South Carolina involved in a court case with the NAACP, that it was not that city or county commissioners were saying, we're not going to give the same services to the African-American section of town. I remember in Mullins, they all lived, and in Orangeburg, they all lived within like 2 blocks of each other. So they had the sewer services, they had the curbs, they had the sidewalks, they had the parks, but they weren't aware that the other parts of town, which were African-American, at least I believe that they weren't, were doing. The other things, we don't like to talk about the bad things in our history. I've given this example before, and it's actually in the article that was published in 1991. I wrote in '88, actually, on the black squint of the law. In that Mullins case I was testifying in, there's a woman who had grown up in Mullins. She taught in the schools. Her children went through the schools. She had taught in segregated schools. And so she was asked, well, when were the schools integrated? She had forgot that the schools had been segregated. We don't remember sometimes. Maybe that's the way of human survival, not remembering some of the horrors and things, but that's a good example.
All right. That is an excellent answer about how we teach children, in particular, some of these very difficult histories. I know there are a couple of questions in the chat, but I do, before getting back to those, I see some really good ones in the chat. I know that Mary Rita Watson's had her hand up for a good bit, so please go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, thank you. My name is Mary Rita Watson. I am an educator in Dorchester County in Somerville, and I'm struggling with what you were just discussing in getting the full picture out to our students, in which I feel they deserve. But we're running up against brick walls when it comes to the powers that be. And I just had a conversation with our school board chair about this over the weekend. And I feel like the problem is more with convincing people that this is something that everyone needs to know. And, because at the age of 55, when I first started this journey, I didn't know any of this stuff. And I know that I'm not the only white woman who's teaching our children. I know I'm not the only one in that situation. And so, it's hard to convince people that are in charge of curriculum or in charge of training teachers that this is something that we need to do. So I guess my question is, first of all, has anyone tried to do this kind of convincing? If not, do you have any suggestions on how to do this? Because as I spoke to our school board chair, she didn't really seem to think that this was a a big priority for our school district, when in reality it is. But of course, they're all white people on our school board. So they, I think it's a lot of times you don't know what you don't know. So thank you for any information you can give.
One of the things that we've done here, we've done some other places, is a pledge against racism. There was one in Richmond, and a lot of it has come out of the churches, which is a good way. I'm not saying that you have to go to church to do this, but to reach people. And this is where I do like the term redemption. They're in churches. If any place, you should be able to touch people with these ideas of redemption. But that's one possibility. And we have to admit, some of our history is so horrible. I do worry to a certain extent, because I've seen it in my generation. There are people, when they confront their history, it paralyzes them. They feel so guilty, they can do nothing. And then there are others who go the other way, and that scares me even more. And that is, my country, right or wrong. In fact, I was just, I think it's Wednesday, they're going to broadcast it, interviewed by the Charleston Channel 5. They're doing a thing on there as a House bill that's going forward. It's not just teaching the foundational documents we knew were coming, but they want to go back to the 1776 horrible report that literally, it was the day one of Biden's inauguration. He got rid of it, but South Carolina legislature is actually pushing a bill to teach that, which is just the option. I tried to say, and of course, this is one of the things that gets complicated, but if you look in this 1776 report, there is a picture of Martin Luther King Jr. and Frederick Douglass. So I said, well, they use this Frederick Douglass quote out of context. I think he has a much better one that addresses this. There's a difference between nationalism and patriotism. And Frederick Douglass says the best patriot is those who will call his country, and in our case, our teaching, to the task of truth and equality and justice. So it is hard, I know. And I do think, though, it takes movements. And so I've been very pleased with this, with the moral Reverend Barber. We talked about the third Reconstruction, what he's done in North Carolina, reaching out to other places. But also all of these books like White Fragility by the white woman, and of course, Ibram Kendi's work. He's now done a How to Be an Anti-Racist after Stamped from the beginning. So there's a number of books that are dealing with this. In fact, one of the things I think that's happened is that things have gotten much better in a weird way that's caused this reaction. When I went to graduate school at Princeton in 1969, every historian knew that Reconstruction was this exciting, almost glorious period of the adaptation by Robert Smalls in South Carolina as introduced the bill for public education, that a more fair tax system, the state to do things, the development of all these institutes. It was very exciting. And yet it has taken until about now that that's gotten down into the public schools, just how progressive and what a good period for the state Reconstruction was. And I think part of it is a reaction to that. And it is amazing. When I was first testifying in voting rights, I can literally have been on the stand, and they were in a opposing attorney for the county or the school board or whatever would say, well, we don't return to the horrors of Reconstruction. I mean, it was still, in my lifetime, seemed like that people don't understand it. But now you begin to see it. And I debated the Sons of the Confederacy on South Carolina TV because they couldn't get Ken Burns to come down, and they were going to boycott that because he had said that slavery was a cause of the Civil War. And then Haley Barbour, the Republican mayor, now says, of course, slavery was the cause of the Civil War. So I think we've made progress. I don't want to lose that. But what worries me is the sort of backlash and resentment. And I do think part of that is not understanding how it wasn't just that slavery ended, but the institutional racism that sounds like a cliche, but how it really worked through our history has kept African Americans as a group, always always, if not at second-class citizenship, particularly financially behind where whites are. And I think that's important to explain. So I don't want to be too negative about it. But those last 4 years took a real toll on me. I just couldn't believe that this was happening. I still sometimes think I woke up and it was a nightmare. It couldn't be. This could not be the country I love.
Definitely. All right. So another question from the chat. I think this is a rather interesting one from Deborah Billings. It says, Heather Cox Richardson's Letters from an American seemed like an important approach linking contemporary events with history, showing how the past is present or at least shapes the present. Wondering what Professor Burton thinks of her approach.
She's one of my best friends, and along with Reverend Barbara, she's got a nice puff on my new book. Yeah, in fact, you look on the Facebook page, she just posted a picture of my wife. So there you go, a personal Facebook page. I think she's great. I think her book, How the South Won the Civil War, I taught it this year, along when I was talking about the 1776 approach. I do think using documents is important talking about teaching. It's like, that's what I was hinting at before, letting the kids read or read to them what people said at the time. So I had my graduate class just last week or the week before read both the 1619 project and the 1776 project. And we read Heather Cox Richardson's How the South Won the Civil War book as well. So to get back to the teaching. So first, she's great. And as I told her, I don't know how she does it. She's done more to preserve sanity for people for 4 years than anybody I know. And I think she's generally right about most. She had a great one this morning that I thought was right on target. And particularly, I didn't mention it, but that was it 19 or 1895 when the Southern congressmen or legislators all wrote about how the whites should be in charge in the South and not let black folk, and why, and publish this. And so to change this narrative, I mean, it just shows that we created a false narrative from Reconstruction forward on race relations in America. And she's been really great at showing that. And if you know, not only that book, but you would enjoy her book on the Republican Party too. It's really good. All her work is terrific. And I think you're right. I've seen so many people that she has touched. A lot of my friends that we sort of keep together that after our 50th anniversary graduating at Furman are reading her. We have a little group and we all discuss Heather's Letters to an American. And she was at the workshop. In fact, she did the keynote where Brett was that I did for me for the teachers. And that's because she cares so much about teachers. She took time to fly down to do that for us at Clemson. When was it, Brett? It seems like yesterday, but it's a couple of years ago now, wasn't it?
Robert, I don't know what the question was there.
It doesn't matter. It's not
But
important. I'm trying to think when Heather came down to do the keynote for the workshop for the public school teachers at Clemson. Well, it was 2018, what, December 2018? I can't remember.
know.
Me either. Yeah,
That's a question for Dr. Green.
I'm actually not sure when she came down. If it was 2018, I was knee deep in dissertation writing. So yeah. the world outside of that did not exist for me at that point. But I think it was fairly recent.
Yeah. And that was when she was thinking about that book. That's sort of part of where she got the ideas. I think that's an interesting question because it comes back to her doing that, where she was doing the teacher's workshop keynote for me. And she laid out and sort of sketched out the idea of how the South won the Civil War, which is what a lot of these letters from an American are from. Mm-hmm. So she was trying to reach public school teachers through that in that way.
Very fascinating. All right, so we got another question in the chat. I think this one's actually rather interesting because it has sparked some lively conversation about the role of religion in public life and in teaching and interpreting history. This is from Michael Moten. It says here, do you think that religion plays a part in our acceptance of materials without critical thinking? He's speaking of the internal arguments of Christianity. I thought doctrines were locked from the beginning. until I started reading a Christian controversy book assigned in a class my wife took. As a major part of many of our lives, it seems that the way religion is taught, it conditions us to accept uncritically one's interpretation of history. So, Dr. Burton, have a response to that question?
Yeah, well, first of all, I take my faith very seriously, but what has happened politically with religion, the way it's used, it really bothers me. So even the term now being a Christian can set people off pretty badly. So I generally identify myself as a follower of the historical Jesus. And Brett will appreciate, I used to have some very long night arguments with Modjeska Simkins, who was not a fan of religion at all, and part of it for this reason, I think. But it's become so politicized. I don't really care if there's a heaven so much, but I can tell you some of the ways people, particularly politicians, have manipulated and used religion to have people vote against their own interests and for what is right. If there's not a hell, for these people to burn in, I'm not going to be very happy in heaven. I don't think I can, because I think that's one of the greatest sins that I have ever seen, is the way our churches, so many of them, they're not all, but so many of our churches have been so corrupted into politics.
We being the thoughtful people, have ceded morality because we're so damn thoughtful and we're so polite. And the folks that are taking the high ground here, that are making the rules, are not thoughtful and they're not polite. And so that's part of the problem.
Well, they're manipulative. I'm sorry.
There you go.
I just, as I said, as someone who takes my faith seriously, and I try to never judge other people's religion, but I've gotten bad at it. I can't, when you see it used as it is being used now, so different than what the tradition and what it should be and what it was meant to be. I mean, and we can talk about it, in terms of the power. Ben Mays wrote about the Black church and the sustaining power there for people. But it has been manipulated in terms of for whites in this last, well, I don't know how many years, but quite a while now, at least since the civil rights movement, except for brief periods, is turned into a way to manipulate people politically. And it's just really sad when you have politics and religion that intertwined in the way it's become, particularly in a state like South Carolina. But that's one of the things, the nation's becoming a lot like the South now, not the best ways.
All right. Any other questions tonight from the audience? We're going to be here. We can't be here until 8:30. So any additional questions from folks tonight?
And I was supposed to talk about politics, and I'm happy to do that and answer specific things, but I will send the 2 papers for Brent to put out to people. What about the forward to Dr. May's autobiography? Would people like a copy of that as well, Brett?
Vernon, you said anything you send us, we'll share with people.
Anybody, don't force it on them. They're welcome to it.
I do want to point out that Dr. Burton's piece, that is the forward to the Sims book, which is considered to be kind of the classic autobiography of Ben Tillman, is a 28-page forward that Vernon wrote in 2012, somewhere not too distant past, at the reprinting of this book that came out in 1940s.
It was early.
Yeah, so this book that was written by Mr. Simkins, who the first time I've heard anybody say that he was actually distantly related to one of Modjeska's relatives. I knew the name was very similar.
Modjeska's the one that told me that.
Well, then it was probably true, and it would have been on the Andrew. It would have been on Andrew's side of the Simkins family, because that's the white family of the Simkins in Columbia. One of our people worked as a law clerk in the law office of the Monteith firm, and that was a family that her father was part of, and that the woman that was part of our operation at Grow at the time was a law clerk. There's helping out there, and she was afraid to mention any relationship with the family because she thought they'd be embarrassed. And there was some occasion where Modjeska was in the newspaper and they were all applauding. And so she was a bit taken aback. But that relationship between the black people and the white people goes so back, so far, so deep, and it's so entangled with all kind of culture and different relationships that we see the situation that Vernon pointed out earlier of having Essie Mae Washington's name being the only black name that's on the State House grounds. That was Thurman's, I hesitate to use the word illegitimate, but certainly not expected, daughter. I asked Miss Simkins, probably in the 80s, it may have been earlier than that, why she wouldn't talk about that. Miss Simkins was in the president's office at State College when Governor Thurman's limousine came in, and he openly went to visit Essie Mae at State College. And Miss Simpkins' response to why she wouldn't talk about it was that he did right by the girl. We're not going to talk about it till after he's gone. And so it's just the very kind of complex circumstance that's coming out of this very complex reality that we live in, where things are just so manipulated by perception and the way that's taught. So there's so much encultured and so much unlearning to do that the teachers just, you're swimming in water that is just muddy and you can't see through it. And we have to just keep doing what we're doing with the types of things like the Modjeska School, which is just nipping at the edges of it, but to keep the reality alive and to lift up scholars like Vernon Burton and Robert Greene, and to believe that there is an opportunity for us to find people that actually think that caring does some good. And that's what Modjeska did. That's what set her apart. She would challenge indomitable forces because she felt that caring did some good and made a difference in her life. That's part of what we want people to leave the Modjeska School with. This is not a history class. This is a class about repression and resistance and how you make your life here worthwhile. And so that's my preaching. Vernon, take it back there and talk about politics. But we teach nonpartisanhood because we believe that all of us have the same common needs. So let's focus on those. And it's nonpartisan. It's the partisanhood that has really divided and destroyed democracy in this country.
I hope it hadn't destroyed it. I'm concerned.
It's wounded.
Well, no, I think, yeah, I think everybody would say, at least major historians would say that we're in, well, I guess the best way to say it, I'd like to say, at least we're in a teachable moment, but probably is a crisis in democracy like we haven't seen since the Civil War. Hopefully we've ridden over it, but I think your thing about bipartisanship is interesting. It's complex. We're going to talk about the Constitution. Remember, it's George Tillman, and there's several quotes, but who opposes a rule about the one-drop rule for African Americans to be disfranchised and things. And he says that, one quote I know for a fact, he said that some of the best families, who fought for the Confederacy had African American blood, and others say that he said that, they wouldn't, everybody was sort of had African American blood in the state of South Carolina. And there was the famous genealogy study not too long ago that suggested that Louisiana or was it Mississippi and South Carolina would be black majority states today if everybody did their DNA test.
That is definitely an interesting thought, to say the least. One that I think we'll be wrestling with for the rest of this class. But I do want to get to a few more questions for the night wraps up here. Cecil has an excellent question to chat. And before we get to that one, I know that Eva Keith has had their virtual hand up for the last few minutes. So Eva, please ask your question. And then Cecil, I'll call you to ask your question.
Good afternoon. Actually, it's Malefi Ascari.
Oh, okay.
How you doing? Good afternoon. I want to ask a question. And it's something that someone asked me a few days ago. And you mentioned earlier that, Black folks are still looked upon somewhat of a second-class citizen, not just in South Carolina, but in this country. So this person asked me, how do you respond to when a white person tell someone you ought to go back to where you come from? which kind of goes back to this thing, right? That still somehow Black folks looked upon as not belonging in this country, right? So Dr. Orville, you shake your head, you understand what I'm saying here, right? So, and it's even like, you look at Donald Trump, right? Who is a first generation American because his parents come from Europe. But even for him, right, just by virtue of the color of his skin, he has a right, I feel like he has a right to tell people that's been here for several generations that somehow they don't belong here. And this is a reality that we deal with, right? And earlier you mentioned about Lincoln, and during the time of Lincoln, right? I don't think that people don't recognize that Lincoln and people during that time period recognize that Black folks deserve reparations in this country. You mentioned reparations earlier. That a lot of folks recognize that Black folks deserve reparation for free labor, and also they deserve land. And land was set aside for them and taken back, taken away from them. But without land and money, right? Basically, what it left Black folks in this country as contract labor, free labor, contract labor, cheap labor. And so when we start talking about history, right, how do you reconcile all these things that have occurred to Black folk? And also, right, even in terms of teaching, we talk about Black history, and it's only taught one month out of the year. Only one part of it is set aside, right? So how do we rectify these things, right, in order to tell that Black people have more of a voice in this country, and they have a voice that they can tell the story that they want to tell it the way we want to tell it versus being told by white people.
It's a lot to unpack. Let me just deal with a little bit of it. And I do think that one of the problems is almost all our textbooks are still sort of nationalistic. One of the things I said is, why in the world do we want a 1776 project? The textbooks are pretty well that way now, pretty nationalistic and not about patriotism. But at the professional level of historians, I think you're seeing a lot of that. And that's partly where I was trying to go about African-American scholars were excluded to tell that story. Now you have a lot of really terrific African-American scholars like Robert here, who hasn't that long finished his PhD and is now teaching. And so when you think about W. Du Bois writing his great book on Reconstruction, he couldn't even get into some of these segregated archives and things. University of South Carolina now would love to have the Penn Center papers, and they actively go out and try to find papers that can be used as sort of the documentary record to tell the story, at least the interpretation of the evidence in a better way. So I think it's there. And like I said about the Civil War, it took a long time for it to get down from the graduate school level to the public schools, but I think it finally has. And I'm thinking that Reconstruction and the rest of this story will, if we can just keep on pushing. But education itself is important. We have to fund education in South Carolina. We've got to pay teachers. That's what Robert Smalls understood at Reconstruction, that you've got to, he and Lincoln agreed, you have to have education and an educated public to, in fact, have a democracy work. And that's part of our problem, I think. As you're saying, people just do not know. And, it's the same thing that you're saying about not belonging. This just happened that people become aware of with Asian Americans. And this idea of where are you from? Who nobody asked that to white folks. But the idea of who really belongs. And that's a tough question, but there are a lot of scholars dealing with it. So I do have hope, and I see a great generation of scholars who are a lot more sensitive and aware of these issues now than they were even when I came along.
All right. Okay, so we have a couple of questions that I want to get to. First, Cecil, go ahead and ask your questions. And I see in the chat that Dr. Gallman also has a question too. So after Cecil's done and after his question is answered, Dr. Gallman, please go ahead with your question too. So Cecil, go first, please.
Thank you, Dr. Green. And also thank you, Dr. Burton. I'm honored to hear your presentation this evening. I'm a great fan. Given the ideological differences that characterized the founding and the cultures of the colonies at Virginia and Massachusetts and Charleston, I perceive that the most malevolent elements of conservative public policy in America today can trace its roots to South Carolina, if not to Charleston specifically. To what extent would you disagree with that theory?
I'd have to think about it, but I am very concerned that we created the narrative that so many people get into it. And one of the things that Brett has sort of wanted me to talk about is how the link from Martin Witherspoon Gary, who's of course from Edgefield, and Matthew Calverth Butler, into Ben Tillman, and from Ben Tillman to Jimmy Burns, and then Jimmy Burns to Harry Dent and Lee Atwater, and all of that and I think there's a lot to that. But I hadn't thought so much of that whole thing. You know, I think of Charleston and Beaufort, and I think of Robert Smalls. So there's also a great tradition that comes out of there, the AME Church. So that's one of the things that we tend to do that goes back to the previous question. We think of our history as a white history. And that's the first element. You know, I argue in my presidential address to the Southern that, you know, basically what makes the South is the interaction of black and white, not culture, but history as well. And so I think that's important to recognize that there are other traditions that come out of there. And one of the stories I like the most, of course, is Henry Brisbane, the minister who was pro-slavery down in Beaufort area, and who got engaged in arguing with the abolitionists and the anti-slavery, decided he was wrong. He goes and sells his slaves and moves to Ohio, gets a crisis of conscience, buys back every single person that he had enslaved and frees them, gets them to the north, except for one who, when he is asked to do the Emancipation Proclamation reading at Beaufort, or I guess it's at St. Helena Island, he looks out and there was a Union veteran who is the only other enslaved person who had freed himself. And he is appointed by Lincoln through Chase. And that's why people at St. Helena today, because he's one of the tax commissioners, those tax commissioners allowed for African Americans that had gotten the land there, as opposed to having given it back with Sherman's order and things that was that President Johnson, Andrew Johnson, ruled otherwise, they could keep it. And it shows again the importance of the vote and who's appointing judges and who's making those decisions. So I think there's more than one tradition, but I can see your point. I'd have to look at it more carefully before I came down on it, but I think we agree on a lot of things, particularly today, of how politics have come. You know, and I've said this, I've actually written it, it hadn't been published because people don't like it, but I do think that what I see with Donald Trump, and I don't mean this to be so partisan, but it shows, it seems to me that Donald Trump has just Ben Tillman gone to New York. Playing that kind of politics, the demagogue and the just outrageousness and the lying and getting away with it, and somehow championing people who he's really not necessarily caring about. So it's interesting. In fact, I think there's a positive side to Tillman, as I said, too, much more than I think of the other president.
All right, and Dr. Goldman, go ahead with your question, please.
First of all, I need to apologize. I had another meeting that went much longer than I thought it would. So I came in late, but I'm very anxious to listen to the presentation when it's put on the website. With what I have heard, it seems as though that there's and I hope I'm not going into something that had already been discussed. It seems like it's a problem with historiography. You know, we think about the Dunning School, how the Dunning trained generations upon generations of historians to tell lies, and the lies became accepted as truth. And now what we're confronting is people who after being confronted with truth would prefer to lie. And we're seeing that in the way that they're writing textbooks in Texas. And also the ladies, the daughters of the Confederacy who presented the, I call it the apology evaluation for history, and saying that if anything is written about the Confederacy, it has to be positive. I think that we're still suffering from that, and the Black historians actually were not able to be published to refute any of the lies until Carter G. Woodson created the Associated Publishers, so that the Black historians could be published and put their work out there in an attempt to at least try to negate some of the pernicious lies that were being passed on as history. And I think we're still actually in that process of doing that. I just say that to get a response.
If you're asking a response to me, I agree with you. I do think what we have is a really good professional historians working, but one of the problems, anybody can claim to be a historian, but historians are trained, and as I said, I think that historians are doing a good job at getting at what really happened. This is a problem. You have to work with evidence and things. And I said the evidence for so long, at least to into the 1970s, most archives were not interested in even collecting Black work. And certainly the Black scholars couldn't get into the archives to even see, to give different interpretations. It's pretty amazing to see the work that was done by a number of Black historians when they were excluded from the archives, just how good it was. But I do think that we can approximate and get at the truth. And I think, at least among professional historians, we're doing a better job, in particular because we have so many more African American scholars who are actually looking at the history as well. But I think there is an understanding that we are trying to approximate the truth. But there's a reaction to it, just like you say. And that's why I don't even understand the 1776 project. As I told the newspaper, it seems to me this textbooks are already pretty well teaching it the way that is in the public schools, as you said, the way that they want it to be taught. And that's what we've been trying to fight against. That's one of the problems, is how it is being taught and not dealing with these difficult issues that have to be dealt with, I believe. If you sweep things under the rug, you're more than likely going to trip over it at some point. I think that's what we've done for a long, long time by not dealing with the unpleasantness of our history. It's tough. I mean, this is one of the things about, quote, and I don't even like using the cancel culture. I think there is a side to say, if you take down Ben Tillman and you rename Tillman Hall, which I argue you don't have to rename it. It was Main Hall. It was renamed Tillman Hall. But what? You don't want people to forget that you also had these people there arguing the things they've done, and it's a tricky balance. That's the problem of trying to get at the truth here with all of this. But I have some hopes because of the Civil War. I mean, it was a I mean, what was it, 1991 or so, when I came down and people threatened me about that debate on South Carolina Educational Television. They took me out the back door, said I shouldn't stay at the hotel. People were so mad, all because someone saying that slavery was the cause of the Civil War. And yet now I think people, almost all major historians, agree with that and accept. And I have hopes that with Reconstruction and race relations, with all this good work that's coming out by people like Ibram Kendi and others, it's going to make a difference. But it does take a long time. And as we all know, as the teacher pointed out earlier in the question, you know, the school boards and the legislators control so much of what can and cannot be done. It's politicized. And that's why I put the emphasis on the vote. I remember one of Benjamin May's quote when he said about the anti-lynching bill. He says, we don't need an anti-lynching bill if you let us vote. We'll take care of that. But I think this last election shows the difference that voting makes in a democracy, that people have to get out and vote to make a difference.
Dr. Burton, historians don't write history. The winners write history. And I've noticed in South Carolina, the United States, for the last several hundred years, it's the rich white guys have money, and they determine what goes in the textbooks. The best example is we have a board of education that's appointed by the governor, and it depends on who the governor is, who the board of education is. But Texas has the largest class of students in America, and Houghton Mifflin is the largest producer of textbooks in America. And when the Texas Board of Education decided they would delete the word capitalism from all the textbooks in Texas, Houghton Mifflin had to delete the word capitalism from all the textbooks in all the states they distribute them to, and put in their free enterprise, which sounds so much warmer and fuzzier than capitalism. So that it's up to us, folks. I'm sorry.
I'm going to take issue with you about who won. I mean, right? If the South, and you know, now Heather's saying that the South won the Civil War, but way when I was teaching Illinois, the Union won the Civil War and ended slavery in 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. But the South wrote the history, and they won that writing of the history, so that became the dominant narrative, and people want to believe it. You know, it always amazes me that we don't like to take responsibility. But I've often said we historians are partly responsible for the situation because of the history we've written and the history we've taught.
Well, Dr. Burton, I want to end with kind of an optimistic spin on the collapse of civilization and look back at the pandemic of the 1300s. Half the serfs in Europe died. And then when the pandemic went away and the lords told them to go back to work, they said, I don't think so. The guy down the street's going to offer me twice as much. It created classes, which then kind of grew up to create various things, middle class and et cetera. And the Spanish flu of the 1900s, it yielded in a large part of some of the things that happened with the new society that Roosevelt pushed. Pandemics are big time changers, and that the Republican Party is clearly at a loss. The Democrat Party is not really doing very well, and they've been drinking it the same well. And so there's a tremendous opportunity for those of us that speak truth to power to keep speaking. And we really do appreciate you, and we hope that you keep talking for a long time. And
well, I appreciate what you guys are doing there, and I'm sorry I didn't quite have the presentation like I wanted to. But
no, you're dandy. But I'm not going to let you go until you tell me, why did Walter Edgar call you? I can't remember what he called you, but it was not nice. He said you were delusional. I think he said Walter Edgar called this man delusional. Speak to that, sir.
Well, I like Walter Edgar, and we're friends. But when I wrote that article, the 1991, that was a festria for George Rogers, not the George Rogers the stadium's named after, but the historian George Rogers, a longtime chair and had a lot of graduate students, and they did a festria. And so most of the essays in the book were like, South Carolina had the greatest theologians. South Carolina had the greatest geography and beautiful places. South Carolina had the greatest attorneys. And then I wrote the essay called The Black Squint of the Law. So Walter was very unpleased, and he actually said, that's part of why I came home. He said, if I had lived here, that I probably wouldn't have said that if I hadn't, there wasn't no way. So did it. But Walter, I really listen, Walter Edgar's done more for history. Until his textbook on South Carolina, the textbook was written by the person who wrote The Black Squint of the Law, was David Duncan Wallace, who was a bourbon historian who literally, was extraordinarily racist history. And that was the one that was commissioned by the American Historical Association. And Walter, through his journal and through these histories, has done more to help South Carolina, I think, and get it straight. My interpretation is a little different, but he has really done a tremendous job, I think, to make people aware of their history. Not enough on the Orangeburg Massacre, maybe, but he's at least aware of it and gets it in there. But no, he did not like that. A lot of the 2 times I interviewed for a job, of course, was that's what they asked me, that they thought. I remember at Clemson. Well, actually, one of Walter's students, when I interviewed at Coastal, said, "Well, how do you feel about?" I thought you didn't like South Carolina. I said, "I wrote that article because I love South Carolina, not because I disliked it, because I want us to, as Lincoln say, listen to our better angels." And when I got here at Clemson, the first thing they said was, "Well, I guess you'll want to tear down Tillman Hall." And I said, "No, but I'd like to build a Gant Hall that overshadows it and makes it look like a puny little building."
All right. So I know there are some more questions out there among the audience, but we are unfortunately just out of time. And I wish we get those questions, because this has been a great Q&A as always at the Modjeska School. But I do want to give everyone some time to kind of wrap up for the evening. And I want to again extend a special thanks to Dr. Vernon Burton for sharing some time with us this evening. I know that every person's time is precious right now with the pandemic and everything else going on at the moment. So again, thank you so much, Dr. Burton, for joining us this evening. Now, again, as a friendly reminder, we do have another class coming up next week, class number 3 in the Modjeska Simkins School of Human Rights. And this one covers the time period from 1895 until 1945. A relatively unimportant time in the history of South Carolina and the nation at large. But next week, we'll be talking more about, of course, folks like Ben Tillman, James Burns, other illustrious figures in South Carolina's history, but more importantly, also talking about the people who resisted the Burns and the Tillmans of their day, and who tried to make the Palmetto State the kind of state that it should have been and hopefully can still be. Brett, do you have anything to add to that before we go?
I just want to unmute everybody and let them clap for Orville. He's done such a wonderful job for South Carolina and history, and may he live on. Thank you, Vernon. Tune in more often.
Again,
take us home.
Brett, best to make sure that class is next week, April the 5th, correct? Class 3. Yes.
Correct.
Oh,
okay.
Yeah, and that's a critical class, Vernon. We would appreciate your input and listening and your pushback. And one of the things, you can argue with Vernon, and he's really polite when he pushes back. And so it's really good to have him on board. And may he live longer. And thank you all for being here, and stay tuned. We're connecting the dots. You don't have all the dots outlined yet. This is only class 2. We haven't even got to class 3 yet. There's more classes. But all this fits together in a way that you will find quite empowering before it's over with. So stay tuned. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Have a good night.